Hi, everybody. We're just going to let people filter in. It's a little bit before 12. If you're here and you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat, then please feel free to do that. If you already have some questions that you've thought about with housing, you can feel free to enter those into the chat or into the question and answer feature that's either at the bottom or the top of your screen, depending on what browser you're using. Just as a reminder, this is a webinar format. Some of you may be more familiar with the Zoom meeting format where you can see everybody. With the webinar format, you'll see myself as the moderator and our esteemed panelists, but your interaction with the hosts and panelists is limited to the chat, raising your hand, or using the Q&A. So that's why we welcome you to introduce yourself and let people know where you're from, and you can feel free to interact with other attendees through the chat or the Q&A feature. All right, while we're letting people come in and get settled and introducing themselves, I'm just going to start off with some housekeeping. It's always important to do on these types of events. The first thing I'd like to do is start with our land acknowledgement. I am in Springwater in Simcoe County. So for me, although not everybody is probably in the same area, but at least for me, we're gathering in the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. And we wanted to ensure that we're honoring the First Nation communities. In our area within Simcoe County, there are actually 3 existing First Nations that are part of the Chippewa Tri-Council: the Rema First Nation, Bow Slave First Nation, and Georgina Island First Nation. And we wanted to recognize that their ancestors were the first stewards of these lands, and to this day, they continue to be stewards of these lands. The lands that we're residing on and benefiting from were meant to be shared with nature and with everybody that lives here, and in a way that honors life. But as you can see, if you go through the history, the history of the land clearly demonstrates we haven't lived up to this intention or promise. So we have to start thinking about having hope for future generations and the sustainable world we want to have for them. And in order to do that, we have to recognize the value in each other. We have to reconcile for past tragedies and ensure compassionate care and concern for all. And then further, we have to recognize that the various components of our ecosystems, the things that keep us healthy and alive, our air, our land, our water, our flora and fauna, are all interdependent, and they need to work in harmony. So the only way that we have hope for future generations is working together. So that was our land acknowledgement. And then some of you may not be familiar with Simcoe County Greenbelt Coalition. So I just want to do a brief introduction. My name is Margaret. Many of you probably have an email from me. Sorry if you feel like I'm spamming, but I think this municipal election is a really key opportunity to address some of these bigger topics like housing, like climate change, addressing inequality. So in 2017, we were incorporated. The idea was to better protect our natural landscapes and promote healthy and sustainable communities. Back then, we were just 15 member groups, and now we have about 42 grassroots community organizations and larger networks that aren't members, but that we work with regularly. Our focus is to help educate public and elected officials on how to build communities that are climate friendly, avoid costly sprawl, and are financially sustainable while maintaining the green spaces we need to avert climate disaster. As the Canadian Medical Association has told us, only about 20% of our health outcomes are attributed to healthcare resources, our hospitals, our nurses, our doctors. The remaining 80% are considered social determinants of health and include the environment, housing, income, and social connections. So our goal at SCGC is to help connect, educate, and mobilize communities to ensure we have healthy, equitable communities. To help foster that goal, we've launched our Community Leaders for Sustainable Simcoe, which is an education and networking program. This program, and today's webinar is an example of, is aimed at supporting local councillors and community leaders as they make brave decisions to take climate action, build better communities, and address the social determinants of health. We have launched a pledge that you can sign. I believe Adam will put that link into the chat, and that's a way you can publicly demonstrate your commitment to the principles. In the coming weeks, we'll also be promoting this program and its signatories with the public. And then finally, today we'll get to the meat and potatoes of why you're all here. We're going to be having an informal, hopefully light and interesting panel discussion about housing policy and how it can be used to create affordable, climate resilient communities that are financially sustainable. Our panel of local experts will also be taking your questions at the end of the discussion. So as I said earlier, if you'd like to submit a question for the panel, you can enter into the chat or into the Q&A feature. So without further ado, and thank you for humoring me, today's panelists, we have Mary Anne Denny-Lusk, who is the CEO of Barrie Housing, and she's also the chair of the Simcoe County Alliance to End Homelessness. Kevin Eby is a renowned planner and a former director of community planning for the Region of Waterloo. And Robert /Bob Schickendanz is former president of the Simcoe County Home Builders Association and also the former president of the Ontario Home Builders Association. As I was talking to the panel before we started, this is a big topic. There's a lot of nuance to it, a lot of details. I will not be pretending that we can get through all of it in an hour, but I'm really hoping that our panelists can provide you with different perspectives and some information about policies, about some considerations you might have to have if you become a counselor. And so consider today's conversation just a amuse-bouche. It's just a way to get to understand the complexity that our housing situation is in. So let's start at the basics, because housing policy is full of terms that seem to be used interchangeably. You know, someone talks about affordable housing, and then that means one thing in policy, it means another thing to people's misconceptions, for example, or attainable housing versus social housing versus market housing. So I was wondering, and we'll start maybe with you, Mary Anne, sorry. What are some key terms or concepts that you think people need to kind of understand before we can actually venture into the meat and potatoes of this discussion?
Yeah, I think affordable housing is a broad term that's been used. That means just affordable housing for people in general. But the definition, it varies from person to person. We see a lot of information in the media about social housing or affordable housing, but what does that actually mean to each individual person? So by definition, people are supposed to be spending 30% of before tax income on shelter allowances or shelter, and anything more than that is not deemed affordable. So that affordable housing is different for people who are renting versus people who are buying a home, and depending on their financial circumstances. So affordable housing has just become a generalized term, and whereas normally we break it down to housing, we will break it down into emergency shelter, social housing, transitional, and supportive housing, which offers different variety of opportunity for different people, and that affordability is a little bit different.
Perfect, thank you. And I know I'll want to come back to you a little bit if we can get into maybe some of those differences in how that spectrum works and how it's maybe different as the market housing. And speaking of market housing, Bob, would you like to add some things that you find some definitions or some terminology that kind of gets loosely thrown around?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll backtrack a bit, Margaret, to what Mary Anne spoke to. I mean, there's sort of like a definition of affordable housing, and then we talk about attainable housing, and that's maybe for a lot of people a head scratcher. And you know, to me, it's come to light in terms of attainable housing. Can we, you know, if somebody's considering or wants to, you know, rent a place or buy a home, can they ever get there? And you know, unfortunately, we've heard statistically in terms of polls throughout the country, in fact, and in Ontario as well, that you know, it's harder and harder for people to attain a home because and it's unfortunate, particularly with their young people, that they're feeling that where the high price of housing is today, that they'll never get there. In other words, it's not a matter of, okay, I'm going to get my next job or an additional job or through promotions over time. It's just like they've, you know, unfortunately, we call it sort of giving up on the great Canadian dream of home ownership. And that sort of dovetails more, you know, in my mind, that loose definition of attainable. Am I ever going to get there? I may have enough money to or income to support a mortgage, but I'll never get to the point where I can raise a down payment. You know, all those, as Mary Anne alluded to, there's all sorts of context to that is part of that discussion. And certainly market housing is sort of like a market system, that housing is available in a community. hopefully there's a broad range of housing available, and just what the prices are with the new housing, existing housing units. It's essentially a supply and demand that is driving what we call that market housing.
So just a clarifying question, just for my own knowledge. So would market housing then be reflective of what the market or a certain region can sustain? So for example, it's not really targeted to quote unquote affordable, but it's more of like, if you have a higher socioeconomic, market housing would be at this price point versus in somewhere else. Am I misreading that or misunderstanding that?
No, I think you're correct, Margaret. It's really what the marketplace, buyers are willing to pay for the unit, say in a particular unit. I mean, a community, I should say, is that's setting the price level. So in times where we have perhaps a glut of units, and to use the words, sales are slow, more a buyer's market, well, then the market itself will establish what those prices are. I mean, we've seen in this recent run up, there are sort of quote unquote listing prices, and many times they're just arbitrary low to create the bidding wars or whatever. But ultimately, whether a new house or a resale house sells, it establishes sort of a benchmark, and that benchmark fluctuates depending on the demand and the number of units that are in the community.
Yeah, absolutely. My parents bought a house in the 60s in Scarborough, and they bought it for 14,000, and then something like 10 years later was sold for 80,000, and their house was one of the houses that was shown in the Toronto Star, showing just how crazy the housing market's gone. And now I'm like, man, people getting a house for 80,000. That would be a different time altogether. Oh, sorry, Mary Anne, go
That's
ahead.
okay. Just to build on that market too, and we can look at that the same with the rental pricing. Like you look at even Barrie as an example, it's to even find something right now, it's pretty slim pickings out there. So due to the market demand, the price for even a rental property has gone through the roof as well. So it's not even being able to find it or afford it. It's not able to afford it, but to find somewhere to actually rent is even difficult. So the landlords can pretty much charge what they want because people need a place to live. And unfortunately, we've seen a lot of people leaving the city of Barrie to go other places because they just can't afford to stay here anymore.
Right. Absolutely. It just fluctuates, right, with the supply and demand, as Bob had said. Kevin, do you have anything to add to this about some terminology or some loose understandings that really need to kind of be more clearly thought of as we engage in this conversation?
I think the first thing I would say is planning, unfortunately, is a world of acronyms and buzzwords that come up. And for anybody out there, if you're involved in a discussion and you don't understand what these terms mean that people are throwing out, make sure you ask, because there's such a wide range of misunderstanding. There's terms out there being used now that I don't understand. And quite frankly, there's a couple of key ones that are coming forward. The inclusionary versus exclusionary zoning. Inclusionary being allowing a wider range of uses within a zoning category. Exclusionary is really often used for describing neighborhoods where only single detached units are permitted, that you're not allowed anything else. Another one is the missing middle. That term, if you go back 5 years, even 10 years ago, applied to basically multiple dwellings between about 4 stories in height and 10 stories in height. And it was a form of structure that couldn't be delivered necessarily by the development industry because over 4 stories required elevators. And so the cost to build the 4 stories and above required elevators. So the cost to build those was much, much higher. So they went up into the 9, 10, 11, 12 range in height in order to have more units to deliver on the more expensive construction. So that 4 to 10 stories was discussed as being the missing middle. Now the missing middle is everything that's not a single, all the way up to the 10 and 15-story apartment buildings. And so, there's a lot of confusion around that, especially when people are out there promoting, the use of inclusionary zoning to promote missing middle. If you're talking about it, for example, in neighborhoods, nobody's talking about inclusionary zoning being 12-story apartment buildings and, being allowed in every lot. So, there's terms like that that are really important people understand. In the world I work in, missing middle is still the 4 to 12, 4 to 15 range. And what we talk about when we're talking about inclusionary zoning is really soft intensification. So, duplexes, triplexes, possibly, 4 units being permitted on a lot. But, those are examples of very different things. And even in this discussion, it's interesting because market housing in my world is really housing that's being delivered for profit by the development industry, where the other side of it is social housing, nonprofit housing, cooperative housing that's being delivered with the intent being that the amount of profit being taken out of the housing is less, or in some cases zero. So it's really important to understand the terminology because it can create very confusing conversation. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think the point of today's discussion is to realize that to address the housing issue, you can't just have one or the other. It's got to be both. It's got to be a mix of market housing and social housing, if you want to use those two broad buckets, right? But I know for those counselors that maybe haven't been initiated into land use planning terminology, man, there's a lot, even the understanding between intensification and densification, like density targets versus intensification targets and all your acronyms. I mean, we're just touching the surface here, but a lot of a counselor's job is going to be dealing with land use planning. And so hopefully we can help out a little bit of that. So let's, to build onto that point, as I just said, a lot of municipal councilors are going to be dealing with land use plannings, whether it's new zoning or subdivision plans or approving more things. For those that aren't really aware, what is the municipality's role in actually providing housing? Some people might assume it's a federal, provincial thing, not so much a municipal thing. So why don't we start with you, Bob, from your industry's perspective, or your own personal perspective, and then we can go back to you, Mary Anne, from a more of a social housing perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Margaret. I mean, on the planning side, I'll probably defer to Kevin for most of it, but from our industry's perspective, essentially most of the housing and land use policy regulations, or all of them, are governed by the province and provincial statutes, and the Planning Act kind of acts as a Bible. And there's certainly a lot of guiding principles, the growth plan and Oak Ridge and Moraine, et cetera, et cetera. But the role the municipality has, so sort of in more simplistic terms, is I view them as and they have a huge role in this, in that they're the gatekeeper and the facilitator of all these rules and regulations and policies. And being the gatekeeper, it's working, from my perspective and our industry's perspective, is working to, is working through the process so we can actually do the job that we need to do to provide the housing supply. So, at the local level, developing official plans and secondary plans for communities, providing for infrastructure that is funded through development charges to support new housing, all the way down to site plan approval, zoning. I know it's a whole complicated process, but it all flows through the municipality. And that's why the relationship between proponents, builders, and the municipality, and essentially other stakeholders, we have conservation authorities and various other ministries providing input. It all kind of flows through the municipality to make it happen. And you know, the more efficient that they can work to make it happen. Obviously, it's better to, you know, meet the demands of the communities. So, you know, that at a very high level, and I can't you know, we can't, I should say, underestimate the importance of the role the municipality actually plays in this, and that, you know, virtually every touch point, you know, going through the process actually to getting sort of a project started and turning over the keys, flows through the municipality, all the way to, you know, registering plans and issuing building permits and occupancy permits for those units.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely. And like I was trying to warn some of the counselors that may be new, it is a big job and a lot of technical things that have to be understood, I guess. So
And-
Mary, oh, sorry, go on.
And quite a long, you know, quite a process. You know, maybe we'll touch on the length of it, but, you know, quite a process, different, you know, stages to go through. All, you know, virtually everyone involving municipal council decisions. You know, it's critical that it functions properly. It's you know, the cornerstone actually of providing housing.
Yeah. And my personal belief is, because I'm a bit of a nerd now, is that land use planning is the foundation of what your community is like. It's the foundation of how green, how gray, how connected, how spread out, how equitable. I mean, people don't really, that's my personal belief. Everybody can disagree with me. That's fine. Nobody really wants to get land use planning, but it is the blueprint of what your community is going to look like. And you can't address the problems in your community without somehow touching on land use planning. It all comes back to it eventually. So with that in mind, Mary Anne, the whole idea of providing housing, whether it's transitional, whether it's social, like, what role do municipalities play in helping support people that are having difficulty for whatever reason obtaining housing?
I think it's a little different when it comes to social or transitional supportive housing. A lot of that funding comes through the federal and provincial government, through the different ministries, whether that be through the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing or health, variety of different things depending on the type of housing that we're looking at. But I think as far as the municipal government go, it's more so partnering with a lot of the agencies to do a lot of advocating on behalf. And one of the big pushes that we're asking for through different organizations I'm working with is having municipalities create a housing policy or an initiative internally within their own municipalities on looking at the needs and how to assess and address that at each different level. Just so they have an understanding of what's required within their own region, and then moving to even with the Simcoe County, and then lobbying and partnering with the different agencies. So it's a little bit different because it is not necessarily municipal funded, but strong partnerships and policies are needed at each level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would assume, Kevin, turning to you, that a part of the municipality's role in the housing conversation is data, right? Is understanding what you're actually dealing with, what your market's looking like. I mean, whenever we talk, we always end up talking about kind of trends and data and extrapolating forward. So not to lead you to what you have to answer, but just your perspective on that.
Well, I think the first thing is, you know, the discussion earlier about the province providing rules through the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe, the provincial policy statement is, you know, it's very easy to be generally right on policy, but specifically wrong. And you know, part of the municipality's role is to translate that general policy that applies equally, for example, to Kincardine as it does to Waterloo and Toronto. So a municipality's role is partly translating the general policy into specific policy for a municipality. And that means meeting the needs specific to the municipality. And you really only get that through public consultation, very serious look at the data. And I think, you know, Margaret, you're right on. There's such misunderstanding about what exists in a lot of municipalities, what housing needs are in a lot of municipalities, and what changes need to be made. And that really comes through the census information, and even the general census information isn't necessarily enough. There are some special runs that you need to do on that data to really drill down. When you look at, for example, you're looking in a world where Simcoe County, including Barrie and Orillia combined, about 75% of your housing is single detached housing, and a huge percentage of those are owned by people that are going to be over 70 or 80 years of age in 2051. So, the question becomes, do we really need to build a whole bunch more singles? Or in fact, is it time to start transitioning to a world where we're building for seniors and helping them transition out of their single detached houses into the continuum of housing that they're going to need as they age? And so much of that is municipal specific, and understanding what the needs of the community are, what the income levels of the community are. It makes no sense to be out there promoting very expensive housing if in fact the income levels in your community are at a very different state than something that would be able to afford that type of housing. So it's municipalities have that key role. The other thing that municipalities have, just to take another minute here, is they have a real responsibility in educating the community. The community needs to understand clearly that we require housing of all types, of all affordable housing, whether it's social housing or co-ops or intensification, is so critical to the health and well-being of the community in the future. And yet we have so much trouble getting, even small intensification into some of the built-up areas. And municipalities have to get out there and fight the NIMBY world that exists within a lot of the communities. We've got to work with the community to educate them as to the needs of what the community is from a housing perspective. Those are kind of the two main roles that I see in it. Obviously, there's participation in the federal and provincial programs around social housing and more affordable housing. And then there's a big one, which is how do we deal with homelessness? And, I think we'll get to that later, but that's another one that we need to address.
Well, we're going to try to get through as much as we can. We're on question 2 and we're at 12:30, so we will do what we can. But for those of you that are attending, if you didn't get your question answered, by all means, email me and I will try to work with our panel here to get some of those questions answered if they didn't get answered today, because I know this is a big topic. I think that the thing that you're kind of touching on, Kevin, was just understanding the community that you have and also the community that you want it to be. And I would assume that everyone in the panel would agree that housing can be transformative, right? It can be something that turns your community from X to Z, it can be transformative. So we've got all of these changes coming down the pipe for communities across Simcoe and the province, including immigration, changing demographics and aging population, rising inequality. Then of course, let's not forget like climate impacts and those sort of things. So what is your opinion about how a strong housing and planning policy can actually be beneficial to municipalities? Like, how do we stop taking it from housing is just a house to housing can be a cornerstone for building the communities of the future? Like, who would like to take that first? Because that was just, Kevin, do you want to start that off since you ended the last one?
Yeah, I think there's no question that it's interesting when you look at the forms of housing that we've traditionally had in communities over the last 30 years. We end up with a lot of single detached dominated suburbs. They're automobile oriented. You're in a situation where, quite frankly, especially when we started to designed to reduce the impact of automobile. We also reduce the ability of people to move around in their community on foot and on bicycle and in cars at the same time. And so we've created suburban areas that tend to be less inclusive. There's less ability for neighbors to be neighbors, and that's some of the positives that come out of creating what are now more buzzwords 15-minute communities, where everything is potentially that you need is potentially within 15-minute walking distance. So you can go to stores, you can go to entertainment, you can your schools, etc., are all within areas where you can walk. And that starts to create social cohesion within neighborhoods, and really starts, you're out, you get to know your neighbors on the street. It creates a very different environment. So there's a first cut at it.
Thank you. And then I'll turn to you, Bob, because I mean, the industry that you represent, the builders and the family businesses and those sort of things, you know, they're looking at trying to add housing to places where it would be beneficial for the community. So how do you think municipalities can kind of embrace housing that's sustainable? And, you know, how do you think that they can embrace housing as a transformative process versus just it's like just a process, right? Like to put life into the policy versus just doing it because that's what the official plan says.
Yeah, I think that we have to, you know, in aggregate focus on, you know, the notion, you know, Kevin just mentioned, you know, 15-minute communities, but maybe a touch broader than that. We talk a lot about complete communities where you live, work, and play. And, you know, we all have this collective responsibility then to provide a range of housing types, you know, where we can accomplish or move towards that goal. Because, you know, historically, the home has been, you know, for many people, you know, right across the country, has been sort of the retirement plan. Is you know, you buy a house. You mentioned your parents, Margaret, starting at 14,000, and you know, eventually they obviously moved to other homes, as you had mentioned, but you know, we call it getting on the property ladder, however that is, and sometimes it's difficult. Organizations like you know, like Habitat for Humanity get people on the lower end of that property ladder, and a segue into it, but just to get on there, and once you have the ability to get on there in terms of owning a home. I mean, for families and individuals, it's economically beneficial, but then you have a real vested interest in not only your home, but the community you live in, and the pride of ownership. And that's, you know, that speaks volumes in terms of creating these complete communities. So it is really important. It's not just a commodity. It's not just an investment. You know, that's a challenge, particularly with a lot of demands and in terms of it's particular in Simcoe County, but other areas as well, is communities that, you know, many years haven't experienced any growth, now have explosive growth. And how, you know, as to our first commentary, you know, the marketplace is now, because values are going up, making that a significant challenge to deal with. But in the end, is if we can make it work, the communities that we do create, the neighborhoods, they're stable, they're, you know, that's what we want to achieve.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And I would assume, Mary Anne, that your component to this discussion would be like thinking about the affordability and the equity that's created in the community, right? Like Bob had said about getting on the property ladder and not using it as a commodity. There are people that want to be invested in the community that just can't find reliable or affordable housing. There was a paper done, Simcoe County Workforce Survey, I believe, and employers were starting to notice that people that were making minimum wage jobs, like there's complaints that we can't afford to work minimum wage and do housing. and do rent and do food, right? And food is one of the things that's going to go if you have to choose between paying your rent or paying your heating bill, I mean, or your food, you're going to cut down on that. So how would you like to contribute to this part about how housing can be transformative?
Yeah. First of all, just to building on what Kevin and Bob had said, it's building that community and building that structure, but also knowing gathering the data and knowing the communities. But just to further that discussion on the rent, I think when, looking at the rent in Barrie right now for a 1-bedroom unit, on average is $16.23 per month. So when you look at that affordability table, so it's stating no more than 30% of your before income salary is supposed to go towards rent in order to be deemed affordable. An individual will be have to working 40 hours a week, $30 an hour in order to afford a 1-bedroom apartment right now in Barrie, and that's just not feasible. So that's not including food. That is just their apartment rent. And right now, about 30% of the people in Simcoe County are renting. So when we look at the bigger picture, it's the inequity is a big piece of it.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. So we're seeing a lot of comments in the chat about kind of the zoning part of it, and that was one of the questions that I was going to talk to. And I guess I'll start with you. Oh, sorry, do you have to add on?
I just really briefly, I know Bob wasn't implying this, but I more and more, and this is part of the education component I'm talking about with municipalities, rental, just because you own your home does not necessarily equate that you are more involved in the community or take better care of it necessarily. And I know Bob wasn't going there, where what he was talking about actually makes sense, but the implication that people draw from it sometimes is ownership good, rental bad. And the reality is the full continuum of tenures are needed in order to deliver and meet the housing needs of the community. So I'm not being critical, Bob, at all. I just wanted to make sure that that's understood, because things have changed. We're getting to a point where a good percentage of the population likely is not going to be able to own their homes over the period of time. And we've got to accept that and start planning for that.
Well, and you did a little segue, help me with my segue even further, Kevin, because I was starting to talk about how we have to provide all different types of housing within it. And the Simcoe County official plan is in draft. It's been sent to the province. To my best knowledge, it hasn't been finalized yet. And for those that aren't aware, the Simcoe County official plan then filters down to your local municipality. And then there's now rules and guidelines that they're going to have to follow. And those are kind of like the rumble strips of where they have to meet with targets and that sort of thing. One of the pieces in there was ending exclusionary zoning. And I know, Kevin, you touched on it earlier about inclusionary versus exclusionary, but kind of touching a little bit on what Bob had mentioned earlier was when you have municipalities or communities that have not grown a lot or have not had to densify, this will change for some of those municipalities quite a bit. So what does this mean for municipalities when they're talking about ending exclusionary zoning? And how can they use that as a change that's a net benefit rather than being afraid of it and saying, sorry, we're not doing this because nobody wants it? And to Mary Anne's perspective, I'm quite sure, is a really easy way to kind of increase rental, to create downsized units, those sort of things. So what does it mean for the municipalities in Simcoe County for that particular policy, and how can they use it to their net benefit?
I think the first thing it means is that especially the politicians and staff are going to have to work diligently to sell the idea to the community. It's tough going into a place where it's all single detached units and saying, you know what, we're going to allow triplexes, and people think, oh my God, the price of my home's going to go down. I'm going to get undesirable people moving into the neighborhood. There's going to be massive increases in traffic, et cetera. And it doesn't play out that way in most cases. In most cases, people, if you work through it, people begin to understand that may be the way that we can provide housing that's affordable to your children. It may be affordable to your parents as they move forward. It may provide opportunities for seniors who are living in a 28 to 100 square foot home on 2 stories with 4 bedrooms. to actually be able to afford to stay in their house as they age by duplexing it and being able to rent out a portion of it. It's such an incredible opportunity for municipalities, among other things, to better utilize the existing infrastructure. The vast majority of our homes today, single detached units, have 1 and 2 people in them, which is just stunning. That in most municipalities, it's over 50%. So the ability to increase the usage of those types of units is it solves problems. It better utilizes infrastructure at virtually no increase in cost for the municipality, and potentially allows a homeowner to move forward with creating a unit that meets housing demand. We
Yeah,
don't need to depend on the large developers. A whole bunch of people can do it themselves.
And Bob, from your industry, the thing that I know in conversations with you and others that are in your industry, that certainty is really important. Certainty to know that if the policy says this is what is going to be allowed, that it's going to be allowed, right? And I think that there's, from my perspective, it seems like, how home builders look and go, okay, this is the policy. It fits within the policy. We're going to do this. And then they get a lot of public pushback because, as Kevin said, sometimes it's just a fear of change. So what is your perspective on this idea of how to get municipalities to see this as an advantage or a potential net benefit?
So Kevin highlighted, and I agree, there's enormous potential in this type of direction to go in, to create additional units in neighborhoods where the service is there, schools, parks, stores to service, etc. But it's all about execution. The word you said about certainty, but certainty really is execution. So it depends on we've heard the phrase, the devil's in the details. It's highly dependent on if we're going to allow in say a neighborhood 4 units on individual lots. But what does that actually mean in the details? If you're expecting to have 2 parking spots for each of those 4 units, well, the whole scheme falls apart, or the setbacks are enormous, or the coverage becomes that, well, you only can cover, a small portion of the lot. Then all these policies, or at a high level, sounds, oh yeah, it's great. We can create all these units at a hopefully at a reasonable price point, but none of it'll happen because it's tethered to a bunch of all sorts of other items attached to it, i.e. the certainty isn't there.
Right.
And I think that has a lot of merit, but the details have to be looked at all the way through, from the allowing of a number of units and what all the policies are, to how do we get for them to actually be built. At the same time, I believe we should be advocating for, in communities and neighborhoods, to have sort of more growth nodes along major streets, to have more of the, intensification and pre-zone, and have all the regulations, ironed out, I'll call it, so neighborhoods know what to expect, to give that level of certainty. So our industry then can come forward and, assemble parcels or get land use changes, conversions, to build those type of units, and not, be faced with the daunting task of, well, perhaps we could do it, but we have to go through the whole system to see if that can come to pass. And that's enormous amount of time and a cost associated. So, and that sort of skews our industry towards, well, then maybe it's just buy a greenfield site of 50 acres and we know how many homes or widgets we can put on there, because the task of producing housing, an infill situation, is much more difficult, that journey to go through.
And I'm going to have a bit of a hot take here, that, you're talking about the parking spaces, right? You get a duplex and you're going to have 2 parking spots per unit. And I think this would also touch a little bit on your advocacy too, Mary Anne, is that You cannot have a really great climate change plan and still consider growing in the way you did 50 years ago. And from my perspective, car dependence and how we've built them before, everything is for the car. So when we build an apartment building, everything has to have a parking spot for every unit. You get a duplex. Now you need two parking spots. The 50% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions come from municipal decisions. Most of that comes from land use planning decisions. What we keep, what we don't keep, where we build, how we build it, right? So if you consider yourself, if you're on here and you consider yourself, I am a real climate change advocate, I am a real environmentalist, you have to start buying into the idea, which is supported by evidence, that housing is one of your key climate actions. Putting it in the right spot to allow people to get around in communities without a car is the most effective way that municipalities can address climate change. That has been shown by the IPCC, that is your biggest bang for your buck. So housing and the environment are not oppositional. They don't have to be. They actually can support each other very well. But as what Bob had said, if you just because you make it so with a large policy, if you don't facilitate that and make it easy to build that kind of housing in a way that actually realizes the vision, you're falling behind the 8 ball here. So that's my little hot take. Maybe some people agree, maybe they don't, but at least I have evidence behind me. Mary Anne, what would you like to add to this?
I think, just kind of building on what Kevin was saying earlier, with people not wanting it in their community, I think even with social housing and purpose-built rental, we run into a lot of NIMBYism as well. So this policy and giving that information up and knowing that certainty will help. You hear a lot of people talk about affordable housing, but nobody wants it next door to them. And I think that's just a change in mindset. And, again, it's that certainty and providing the information to people within their communities and what it actually means.
Okay.
Margaret,
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Can I one thing? I agree with Bob totally on the need to make it easier, and it's interesting. Pre-zoning land is so important. We found that in the Region of Waterloo. Do the planning, get out there, talk to the community, pre-zone the land. Once it's pre-zoned, you can move forward fairly quickly. Incentive programs that provide for to assist the developer in some of the complexities like contaminated sites in order to help clean those up and start to balance and become really important. And then other programs, there's a really interesting study going on at the University of Toronto at the moment that is taking a look at the form of existing single detached homes and trying to do some templates for how you intensify those. What do you need to do to make it 2 units, to make it 3 units? What do you need to add on? So that's available to people so that there are plans that make it simple. If it's pre-zoned, if you can go to the shelf and pull off a plan that is not offensive, not out of anywhere, you're going and pulling it off the shelf, it becomes easy to do. And especially if you get out there and promote those ahead of time within the community, that's what you got to do. You absolutely have to create that certainty that Bob's talking about, and you've got to ease the road to the final product every single way we can.
Yeah, and everybody on here probably has had a point in time where they've decided to change their eating habits or their exercise habits. And you're like, well, I could or make myself a salad, or I'm just going to eat the piece of chocolate cake that's in the fridge, or whatever your situation may be. I mean, we expect industry to behave opposite to the human condition, which is if there's an easier way to do it, then you're going to do it, not because you're unethical, not because you're a bad person, but because why would you choose the harder road? Very few of us choose the harder road every time. And that's where kind of that NIMBYism discussion gets into as well, because the harder road is saying, yes, we need housing. Yes, we need the new assessments to help us with servicing. Yes, we need to make this a part of our climate action. And we're going to educate you, and we're going to stand up for what's in the best interest of our municipality. I'm not saying that's a broad generalization for every project, because there are lots of projects that are probably ill-suited to what I would consider environmentally friendly. But as a general strokes, we have lots of questions, and I want to just ask one last question, and then we're going to get into audience questions, which I hope we'll be able to get through, but I'm not sure. I would like you to complete this sentence. A council that wants to provide more housing for people at all ages and stages in a cost-effective and environmentally friendly manner would. So a council that wants to provide more housing for people at all ages and stages in a cost-effective, environmentally friendly manner would. Let's start with you, Bob. How would you complete that sentence?
I think, oh gosh, I'm not good at crafting sentences here, but I
your
would
best.
say, I would say, certainly be, and I think you've highlighted here in the discussion that the importance of housing, be pro-housing, because it is so, and in being pro-housing creates certainty, make sure that there's a clear pathway. So whether it's individuals or my membership of the Home Builders Association membership, understand the path and their responsibilities to create housing, how to get from the beginning of the process to the end of the process. That's a must. And with that then comes the confidence to make those critical investments. I mean, we talk a lot about intensification in the, building within the built boundary. But as I illustrated a very brief example, it's much more difficult than buying a large, parcel and away you go with the large, that project. You have to, in many instances, assemble lots together, hold on to them many, many years until you have a block assembled, and then go through the process and deal with neighborhoods. From our perspective, that's just a difficult journey to do. And business always flows where it can be done and the return done more cost effectively. So if we want to go in that direction, and our industry strongly believes in that's important, then we have to have, quote unquote, the right tools in the toolbox to get it done. So
Yeah.
We have to view housing as extremely important in supporting, people in their lives, and really supporting businesses as well. We're trying to attract businesses, jobs to various areas. Those businesses won't come unless they have a workforce.
Yeah, that can afford it. So basically, to use my analogy, you want to make it easy to eat the salad and turn down the cake.
Oh, absolutely. And just to give, I just quickly to give a specific example. So we all know Honda in Alliston, and significant investments are going into that plant. But they can't find enough people to work there. And one of the major problems is that there's not people that can afford, or there's not, I should say, there's not enough housing within that community to support it. So less than 5% of the people that work there actually live in the community. And they're driving from Owen Sound and from Midland and farther afield. So how is that good for, climate change? It's not. It's not. So we got to go beyond having, ideals on paper and create a framework where we can actually execute and get to an endpoint quickly.
Absolutely. Okay, Kevin, will you finish my sentence? A council wants to provide more housing for people at all ages and stages in a cost-effective and environmentally friendly manner would.
Just simply 4 bullet points following your lead in. Work to understand the real needs of the future community. Don't just think that the future is like the past. It's not. Promote intensification and transit wherever it's available or can be made available. Promote nonprofit housing. The solution to our affordability crisis isn't in the private sector. It's in a combination of government and charitable groups and nonprofits. And then for municipalities, pre-plan and pre-zone areas so that there is certainty for both the existing residents and the developers.
All right, Mary Anne, we'll finish this question with you. What would you say?
I think Kevin stole most of my answer, but I think for me it was knowing your community and knowing what the needs are. I mean, it's great to build houses, but if people can't afford to live in those houses, then we're in the same situation that we are now. So it's getting out there and knowing what the community actually needs instead of putting in the fix that you actually think needs to be put in there. So I think it's knowing your community, knowing the people that you're trying to house, and just putting yourself out there.
Mm-hmm. And in general, good data makes good decisions. You know, junk data or no data usually ends up in not helpful decisions. So, all right, we're moving to some audience questions here. And I don't know if I'll throw them to each of you because trying to get through as many as possible. So one of the ones that was really interesting was, should municipalities hang on to public land using social enterprise to create housing itself? Kevin, I think that's probably within your venue, maybe.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a role for municipalities to use the lands they own, they currently own, for housing, and especially the types of housing that otherwise are problematic to get through the private sector. We need to use all the resources that are available, whether that means they continue to own the lands and the units, or whether they transition into something else. That depends on the situation, but absolutely, municipalities need to be taking a look at all the assets available to them to deal with the affordability crisis.
Thanks. This one's for you, Mary Anne, I would think, but of course, Bob and Kevin can chime in on any of these questions. If I don't pose it to you directly, feel free, it's not exclusive. But I'll start with you at least, Mary Anne. Bill would like to learn more about how lower tier municipalities, who usually lack funding and jurisdiction, how they can do more to influence the lack of affordable housing or social housing in their communities.
It's advocating mostly, I think, to the federal and provincial governments. That's kind of where the funding comes through for construction and builds. I think a lot of the lower tier, and even the city of Barrie, they don't own their own social housing. Even Barrie Housing, we're a separate private not-for-profit corporation. So I think just, reaching out and partnering and working with the federal government, and the Simcoe County is a big advocate, and they do own a lot of housing on their own as well. So it's a lot of reaching out and connecting and lobbying the governments. I don't know if that answered the question, but
I thought it did, but I don't know if Kevin or Bob have additions to that.
I just like to add, one point here, Margaret, is that municipalities, large and small, do have some tools where they can actually add value. And we talked about certainty. We talked about timing. Our industry is certainly more receptive to, sort of a partnership type situation, say providing a certain number of units or whatever it may be in the circumstance. If there's certainty in timing, and it can't be just like, oh, we'll fast track you. We'll get you to the end point, say in 12 months or 6 months. That type of commitment, then it takes a significant amount of costs out of the equation that can be reinvested then in some form of supportive or social housing or whatever it may be. So that doesn't necessarily, you don't have to be the biggest city. Even smaller towns have that ability to do. And scale does factor into it to some degree, but there's an opportunity to, the timing is a big one. Density is also another big one in terms of adding some value to projects. So by adding these value pieces, we can create opportunities that don't exist perhaps today, or that's very reluctant for this to work today, that can be utilized in such a positive way. But it has to be very emphatic and I'm searching for the words here now, but it's got to be that it's prescribed or very prescriptive in terms of, if the municipality can do X, then the builder can do Y, And this is like, you know, part of like a partnership model to address the problem or the issues.
Yeah, and I've seen it before in communities where the municipality is very proactive with community design standards. And, you know, there's certain things that they say, hey, you want to build here, here's what we want, here's what we need, here are the zoning, like it's ready for you. And that changes the conversation versus what I find is a lot of reactive, which is we're proposing a development here, and the municipality goes, well, everybody says they don't want this. Now we have to figure out how do we get back and forth? And Mary Anne, I saw your hand up.
Yeah.
Would you like to-
And so I guess one of the things that we're proposing too through another advocacy committee is having a designated person with each municipality. So having a designated person as a contact for affordable housing. So when somebody's looking to do a project or, you know, working in a community, they know who to reach out to. They know where the resources are. I know the city of Barrie has a designated person, but smaller communities don't necessarily have that. But if you could, you know, work within the municipality to have just a point of contact, it just makes it a little easier. And, you know, sometimes it's a little difficult to work your way through municipal, you know, zoning or adding in building and who to contact, and just making it a little simpler to get everything up and started.
Yeah, absolutely. Kevin, I'm going to throw this one to you. This one is about parking. How do we address the impact on parking in neighborhoods? We all know that we need to move more to an active transportation model, but this is not our immediate reality, unfortunately. And that would be true of many Simcoe County municipalities. The little term that I threw around before with car dependence, it is a spectrum. Most of Simcoe County's communities are very heavy on the car dependent scale. And the easy way to test that is if you couldn't have your car for a day or two, would you be able to get your daily needs by not using a car, biking, walking, bus, in a relatively easy fashion? So how do we address this, Kevin, with the parking in neighborhoods, the impact on neighborhoods? How do we start to do that transition?
There's no easy answer. And anybody who says this is an easy transition we're going to go through is kidding you. I think the reality is that parking, so much of parking is, especially in the newer neighborhoods, it is tied to the number of cars that people feel they require. And one of the things that is really important, especially in bigger cities, it's tough in Simcoe County, but in bigger cities, is staging development so that new areas open up relatively quickly and are built out relatively quickly. And key to that is extending transit early on into those areas before people's travel patterns are predetermined, and they go out and buy car number 2 and car number 3. And then we've also got to be careful when designing some of our neighborhoods that we have a situation in Kitchener where somebody built a series of 2 garage semis. So each semi had 2 garages, and you end up with so much driveway space that you literally couldn't fit a car parking on the street. There was nowhere to do it. And so you end up with cars parked every which way. The visitor had nowhere to come. So, you know, design is critical. Promotion of different alternative means, bike lanes, making sure that there's proper walkways through, supporting developments. Like I said, there's no quick and easy answer. It's a transition that's going to have to occur. You know, we're somebody said earlier, we're getting to a point now where apartment buildings in Waterloo region are well below even 1 car parking spot per apartment in some cases. So, and they're working. It's a matter of transition.
And I think it's something that Bob touched on earlier about, you know, pre-zoning housing around transit. I know we don't have higher order transit here like subways or LRT in Simcoe County, but what we're hoping that this discussion concludes is that housing is not just a house. It's also transit. It's also infrastructure. It's also climate. It's also social equity. There are a lot of things that you can do to be a pro-housing advocate, but not in the way that we think of housing from generations ago, right? Now we're thinking about access, and we're thinking about climate, and we're thinking about affordability, and we're thinking about how to transition these communities. Housing and transit and all of those are so key to making that transition. So you can't just make decisions in a silo anymore and expect them to be effective, right? Bob, I have a question for you here. It is going back to a little back to the social housing part. Sorry, I just lost my question. Oh, how can you partner with developers to create more affordable, attainable housing when there is a profit margin to be had? I know you touched on it a little bit, but I just wanted to see if there's anything more you'd like to add to that, because I know, and Kevin's right, we have to be thinking about these nonprofit housing providers and that sort of thing, but there's also probably a place for market housing in this venue as well. So how do you partner with that? How do you use that to your advantage?
Well, I'd like to address that on two I think important points. Even social housing provided by nonprofit organizations, there's a profit baked in that cake as well, because they're not the builders, they're not putting the sticks and bricks together. In fact, in many circumstances, many of those organizations aren't builders at all, and they have to hire management to some sort of general contractor, all the suppliers. So the fact that it's built by a nonprofit organization doesn't mean that there's not some profit baked into that cake. And I'll say it's not much different than a private company doing it. So, and as I said, I think there's a lot of opportunities whereby creating, and we have to have an open mind here, creating these partnerships with private industry, because I'm going to, toot my own horn here a little bit. I mean, we're the experts in actually building it, and we can do it cost effectively. So if we can have a mechanism or a way to get projects built that that really addresses not only social housing, but a spectrum of housing, say in a project, and it's led by a private industry, but it addresses all those things. Well, I think that's the best. I think that's the best outcome. We cover a broader spectrum.
Yep. Thank you for that. I think I have time for one or two more questions here. We're supposed to end at 1:15, so I'm going to pass this. Or Mary Anne, did you want to add anything to that? Sorry, because it was about social housing. So
That's okay. Yeah, and I agree with Bob. Like, social housing providers, we're not developers. Like, I don't know the first thing about developing. I can run the building, but I can't develop. So partnerships are key going forward. I think that's something that we need to look at. It's got to be the future of social housing. It's very costly for social housing providers to build, because they don't have the capacity, they don't have the knowledge, and it's out of our realm. So I think that those partnerships are definitely key for the future of social housing.
Thank you. And Kevin, I see your hand up. You want to?
Yeah, I would agree. Partnerships are key, because there's no way we can expect the private industry, the home building industry, to solve the affordability problem. This is a free market society, and virtually every home builder that I've ever talked to about this issue, when posed with the question, would you sell? If we make lots of land available, will all of a sudden your price of housing come down? Anybody who I think is being candid says, no, I sell at what the market will bear. That's the free market world we live in. So the solution to get to affordability for the segment of the population that can't deal in the market housing world is really around those types of partnerships. The other part is planning. The one thing planners can do, I can't make anything affordable. What I can do, though, is focus the plans on the types of homes that at least have the potential to be affordable. I know single detached homes out in the suburban areas have almost zero opportunity to meet affordable housing standards now. A condo can be $1 million and not meet it, but it can also be significantly cheaper than that. And so using the planning tools that are available to ensure we at least get the forms of housing that have the potential to be affordable. And as well, don't forget that transportation is also part of that equation. If you're building a cheap house out in the suburbs, but you need 2 cars that cost you $10,000 in after-tax income each to operate for a year, that's not very affordable housing. So those are the things that the councils need to think about, and municipalities. We've got to be proactive. We've got to work with the development industry, but also all of the other groups to make sure that we're planning for the right forms of housing, but also develop those partnerships.
Yeah, and that's why I've started to talk more about affordable communities, because affordable, like not to mix the pots between social housing and market housing, but really you want communities that are affordable. You want to be able to access childcare that's affordable. You want to be able to access a school. You don't want to have to be tied to a $10,000 a year cost with a car, right? There's more to affordability than just a house. I know it's the biggest, usually lion's share of a monthly income, but to your point, Kevin, if the house is cheap, but you're now incurred with all these other costs because of how far it is, have you really progressed very, very much, right? Okay, final question. And this one goes to you, Kevin, but I welcome anybody else that wants to chime in afterwards. Now I got to find my question again. Oh, so we have a lot of communities within Simcoe County that would be considered rural, very few that are what we would consider urban. So the question from Lori is, how would a rural community without the social infrastructure serve a higher density population? How do you, it's almost like retrofitting the suburbs in these rural communities. Is that something that we should be looking at? And how do we do that?
I'm gonna, you give me all the really tough questions.
It was an easy question, I know, go for it.
But I think I'm going to throw it back at you a different way, because we've looked at this a lot in the area I live in. You know, one of the things that makes small rural communities, and I'm not talking like little hamlets, but the smaller rural communities that may have a couple hundred people or whatnot in them. The one thing that I don't think people have really thought through is they have an awful lot of those homes that are owned by seniors. And they are almost exclusively single detached dwellings. And most people most people are more interested in aging in their community than they are in the house they're in right now. And in fact, with seniors living longer, there are many, many single detached homes that you couldn't possibly retrofit to make them fit the needs of seniors. And when you look at those communities, it's the current residents that may be the beneficiaries of that type of intensification. The type of intensification we're going to see in those types of smaller communities, I really think needs to be geared towards the seniors, and in particular, the seniors that are living there now in the existing single detached units. And it has a double benefit. It provides housing for people who are long-term residents in that small community and want to stay there. And it helps recycle their single detached unit that now has 1 or 2 people in it, so that it better utilizes the existing infrastructure, puts a few more people in the community to help support the small businesses that are there, and allows that transition to a more balanced housing situation. It's not perfect. You know, you've chosen to live in a rural community where some of those services aren't available. They're not going to instantly happen, but unless you start transitioning,